quite a few questions, and just I apologize if we're not able to get to your question. It was quite a bit of questions that were submitted, so we will try to get through as many as we can within the limited time that we have. So first question, and for this I need to put my other glasses on, unfortunately. Because, okay, Sandra, okay, what do you think will be the long-term consequences of emotional impact on children?
Well, obviously, depression, anxiety, fear. When you don't trust what's going to happen for the next day, especially for children. Children need structure. They need to know their parents are going to be there. They need to know they're going to eat at a certain time. They need to know that school's at a certain time, bedtime's at a certain time. They don't have that. They don't have trust in the world. When you don't have trust in the world, you sometimes tend to go and violate other people's because you don't form bonds and you don't feel that you can trust anybody and nobody respects you. So it can lead to the problems that we might have with maybe early pregnancy, drug use, gangs, truancy. We have a lot of children who are experiencing truancy.
Okay.
Due to the fear factor, they say, why should I go to school? There's no need. I'm not going to be here that long, so I might as well just skip school. Or let's get some pot, and we can feel better about this. So all of those factors.
Thank you. Mr. Christie, we heard today a lot about the benefits and advantages of immigration, but can you speak to the arguments on the other side, the downside disadvantages of immigration or enforcement?
Well, I mean, that is really the other side of the ledger, and I was trying my best. I'm sorry. This is the advantage you get for being on the upper bench. They get her mic. So I was really trying my best to be fair on both sides of the ledger. The argument is, and I think that was sort of the argument in the early part of the 20th century also, is that immigrants are not always a plus, and they're a minus. I think all evidence says, whether it's on the economic front, the contributions that immigrants are making to our economy, they contribute in terms of creating employment, in terms of building businesses that we heard so much about, in terms of helping our sciences, in terms of contributing to the fiscal health of the country. They're all on the positive side. I think on the negative sides are people's inbuilt reaction to the fear. And that's the fear of the unknown. That's the fear of the unfamiliar. And that's been the history of our country. The fear that whether it's about at the level that they will not assimilate, or at the level that they will have an economic drain. That's, I think, been really as much a part of our history as there has been the positive. And I think people over time get to know that the positives outweigh the negatives. And that's why in Maine, in the totality, immigrants have been a net huge contributor to our society and to our country from the beginning of the time as they are today.
Thank you. Chief Wilson, you mentioned citizenship documentation isn't realized until jail. What is your impression of how the courts contribute or refute the fear? Does ICE take advantage of those in the judicial system, or does the court system have similar perspectives on documentation?
Wow, that's a mouthful. I don't know if I can speak directly to that. What I can say is if someone is actually in the criminal justice system, it is because they've committed a crime, versus what Michaela was talking about, which was detention solely based on immigration status. So I think we're talking apples and oranges there. So if someone has obviously committed a crime, that is why they've been fingerprinted, and that is why they are in the system itself.
Okay.
So I don't know if that helps at all.
That's
But
fine.
yeah, okay.
Thank you. Nicole, do any of the local organizations have an open dialogue with faith communities to make sure that sanctuary churches are participants in culturally responsive help that values the desires of the immigrants themselves?
Yes, I would say that we have at least four groups, churches in the metro area who have signed up to be sanctuary churches and have taken in 3 leaders from our community that have been in the news recently. And we have a coalition, Denver Metro Sanctuary, that's been sort of the main education component for other parishes to jump on board as potential sanctuary sites across Colorado. So we have parishes in Grand Junction and Montrose and Glenwood Springs, some in Colorado Springs that have said, if need be, we're ready to step up and our parish is ready to do this. I think one of the biggest sort of outcomes of folks taking sanctuary in the churches has been the education of parish members and general community that come and have an opportunity to speak to an immigrant and learn about this person's experience, their hopes, their dreams, how they ended up in procedures, what they've experienced over the course of 10 years, sometimes fighting their cases. And so it really draws home like the idea that it is your friend, your neighbor, your son or daughter's, friend that they play with at school. And so it's been a really great education opportunity for folks who've sort of had some interest in the issue, but now at a scale and with, templates, so to speak, of things that do work in terms of community education.
Thank you, Nicole. Kit, immigration is often paired with safety. Can you please explain the vetting process that immigrants and refugees go through?
All 14 steps.
Summarized in one sentence.
It's a very complex procedure that does involve multiple different federal agencies, over 14 steps. It's constantly being modified and improved as technology increases. I think it's important to realize that there's biometric testing, like iris scans of refugees when they enter the U.S. kind of process that is consistently checked, that there are interviewers from the Department of Homeland Security that go out and do multiple rounds of interviews. And I always think it's crazy because how do you prove that you've got this well-founded fear of persecution, right, to be that refugee? And so you might be tested against your memory of your husband or of your children to say, well, when you fled your village, was it raining? When you had your daughter, what was the first word that your husband said? Like all of these checks and balances that honestly, I would fail. So it's a long process. I think that you'll find that the resettlement program knows that that many of the people within the program are fleeing violence, and so there is that sense that we want to keep it a safe and a secure program, not only for the communities in which they resettle, but also for they themselves, since they generally have fled the very thing that we're fearing at the moment.
Thank you.
There's all sorts of good PowerPoints and things like that. If whoever asked that question, I can get you all those 14 steps.
Thank you. Georgia, you mentioned that the kids have constitutional rights by virtue of being in the U.S. Is this true under federal immigration law? Do they have these rights only if born in the United States and currently residing here, or is that broader to include all kids?
I'm not an attorney, and I don't play one on TV, so I can't answer the specifics, but our belief is in education, all students have a right to an education. Any student who walks in the door, we are obligated to provide that education to, and so that's our focal point. We know that if students are going to learn, we have to create an environment where they feel safe, where they feel valued, and so that is our perspective and our focus. And I think what we've tried really hard to do in Denver is to allow the political and legal issues to play out in a different place. In the school building, we're here to educate, and so we're trying to create environments where students and families will send students to school so that they are there to learn, and then as needed whether it's immigrant or refugee families, we have families with high poverty. When there are other factors like lack of food, lack of health care, mental health needs, that we create partnerships so that we can get the support so a student can actually come and is capable of learning.
Thank you. Michaela, this is a three-pronged question. So,
Oh, gosh.
and and if you can be brief, that would be great. How long is the average person kept in detention? How much do taxpayers pay per detainee per day? And these for-profit centers that you talked about, how much are they profiting?
Okay, so number one, how long? There are statistics. I don't know if you know off the top of your head the statistics. They're a little bit misleading because they incorporate people who have both been there, for 5 days and then accept a voluntary departure, accept a removal order, and those who are fighting their cases for, what can be a year or two while they're in detention. But I would say, based on our firsthand experience, for people who are fighting their cases and going through removal proceedings, it's typically between 3 to 6 months from when they first are detained until when they get an answer from the immigration judge. That doesn't include the appellate process before the Board of Immigration Appeals. I'm going to be fast, I promise.
Okay.
In terms of costs, there have been different studies, but it ends up costing around $150 per day for people who are in civil immigration detention. And there have been studies that have shown, there are community-based alternatives, ankle bracelets, check-ins with nonprofit organizations that are far more effective in terms of getting people to show up to court and cost far fewer dollars. And in terms of the amount of money, I'll just say that after, on the election, the stock for both the GEO Corporation and the Correctional Corporation of America went up exponentially. So there's huge amounts of money that are being made off of the civil detention.
Thank you. Laura? Yes. So how can the chamber work with conservatives in the Colorado legislature to be able to pass policies that really support what you were talking about with creating that workforce that we need?
Yeah, so I think our approach on this issue is the same as our approach with most policy issues. And the way that we do business as a chamber is we are rooted in data. We deal with facts, and we use those two things to make an argument. So we use economic data to support the need for change, and it's messages that absolutely we get out to both sides of the aisle in hopes that they can see ultimately the benefit of making policy changes.
Here's a question for all of you, and I'll take about three or four quick responses. Okay. Are there any new bills around immigration from the Colorado legislature this past year? And if you were to be able to go and introduce one bill, what would that be? And I thought all of you were going to be clamoring at answering that one.
I mean, if we had the ability to go ahead and I propose a bill once I leave the nonprofit sector, I'd like to maybe look at that, would be for Colorado to take the lead and maybe putting forward a comprehensive immigration bill. That's what I'd like to see happening.
I would say our members, I speak on behalf of member organizations who vote for our policy priorities every year, but I would say to continue our work of local policy relief. So the one thing that our members and our constituency keep asking for are work permits. So DACA was life transforming and transformative to so many folks. For people to be able to get an employment authorization document would be life changing for so many members of our community, not to mention an increase to state resources. If we were able to figure that out, that would be amazing in the absence of other forms of comprehensive immigration reform.
You want to speak a little bit louder, would you?
Oh, I was just going to say, businesses would love that too, right?
Okay.
Any sort of workforce development is welcomed by the business community. I would say we have real needs, and so we would welcome increased number of workers always in Colorado.
Anyone else? If not, we'll move to the next question. Okay. As you know, our audience here is comprised mostly of folks from staff, board members of foundations, donors. So question to all of you. How can foundations, donors, be most helpful at this time? That's for
Well,
anyone.
I would like to answer that. One of the problems and challenges that Centro La Familia has since its inception is that it's very difficult for us to get board members. And what I've assessed over the years is that when people have the ability to be board members, they often opt to go with nonprofits that have maybe more presence in the community, that are not dealing with issues that are as sensitive as immigration, and so we lose out. We really would love to have more qualified board members that could help Centro further accomplish its mission. So if any of you are familiar with any nonprofit that deals with the refugee or the immigrant population, one way you could really help them is by becoming a board member. We really need good board members.
Chief Wilson.
I think. Can you hear me? Okay. I think getting involved in your municipalities, whether or not you, if you're inspired by the things you're hearing here today or the things that you've heard since post-election, getting involved, running for council yourself, if you have that positive influence within the community, and if you're not so inclined, then to hold your city council members and your elected officials, your elected sheriffs, the chiefs of police accountable for what you expect as a Colorado citizen.
Right.
Well, I mean, I've been long enough in this field to say this may sound self-serving, and I didn't mean that. I really think that people don't recognize that the philanthropic community, especially the foundations, have kept the immigration debate alive in this country. There would have been no immigration debate in the way we see it if foundations hadn't really stepped up to the plate, beginning in the 1970s to the present time. I mean, the comprehensive immigration reform movement has been really kept alive despite the paralysis in Congress by the foundation world. I would say that to the extent that any shift is required in the foundation world, it's to the point that McKellar would make normally. Yes, I think foundations have taken a back seat to funding legal services. They have thought that this is too expensive, too complicated, too messy to get involved in. And I think it's time for them to understand how critical providing the legal service at the right time is. And the models that are evolving now, many of them even here, are the things that foundations should look at to become more, to emulate in other places. And, you know, I think the last thing I would say about the employers, I mean, I have actually been quite surprised. I've done some research in red states, Florida, Tennessee, as to how many of those legislators have become very active in improving enforcement of labor standards. And there's been argument made by employers, actually, talk about your point of how good, is that, look, if you allow bad employers to exploit unauthorized workers, that actually depresses wages and working conditions of everyone. And that only helps bad employers at the expense of good employers. That good employers really cannot compete against bad employers if we let people exploit. So sort of having new legislative measures to improve the enforcement of labor standards, I think, would be in the interest of everyone, including good employers.
Okay. And Georgia, I'm going to give you the last word.
I would say continued mental health support for families and for students, because there's trauma that already exists in many of our communities, and now we're exacerbating trauma. And I think the other one is in alignment with you. Our families have jobs, multiple jobs, but they're often low-paying and dead-end jobs. So helping create programs that support families, adults, so that they can become skilled workers and contribute to make life beher for themselves and for their children.
So I'm going to just ask our panelists to remain seated. But before we go on, I just want to give our panelists a great round of applause. They've just been wonderful and excellent, and I hope that you've learned a lot from them today. I also would like to remind all of you that we will follow up with you with a list of resources and contact information for all our speakers as well.